Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series. I'm Paul Vogelzang, and today we have a fascinating episode lined up for you. We're delighted to have returning guest Smithsonian Associate David Taylor with us, an acclaimed author and co-producer of the Smithsonian documentary film, Soul of a People. The WPA Writers Project uncovers Depression America. David is here to share his insights on his upcoming Smithsonian Associates walking tour titled New Deal Projects Walking Tour on the New Deal, a transformative period in American history that not only aimed to revive the economy, but also left an indelible mark on the arts and culture. Against the backdrop of the Great Depression, President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal was a bold initiative to use government resources to address crucial public services and stimulate economic growth. Yet Roosevelt himself predicted that in 100 years, the New Deal would be remembered more for its contributions to the arts than its job relief efforts. We'll hear David Taylor talk about much of that today. We'll also explore that intriguing prediction a little bit more with David's expertise and his engaging walking tour of Washington, D.C. Smithsonian Associate David Taylor will take us on a journey through time beginning at Judiciary Square, where we'll see public sculptures and dramatic courthouse bas-reliefs by notable artists like John Gregory. Our route includes the Henry F. Daly Building, a prime example of classic modern architecture funded by the Works Progress Administration, and the Federal Trade Commission Building, adorned with monumental Art Deco sculptures created by WPA artists. We'll also discuss the renovations of the National Mall and the Washington Monument, pivotal projects of the New Deal era. We will conclude our exploration of David Taylor's walk at the Department of the Interior, home to over 40 New Deal era murals and photo murals by the legendary Ansel Adams. Smithsonian Associate David Taylor's walking tour offers a unique opportunity to discover these still visible landmarks and learn about their historical and cultural significance. So put on your walking shoes, get ready to delve into the rich artistic legacy of the New Deal with our distinguished guest, Smithsonian Associate David Taylor, who will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates for his walking tour. Check out our show notes today for more details about David Taylor and his Smithsonian Associates walking tour. But join us now for a brief, enlightening conversation on the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series. David Taylor, welcome back to the program.
Thanks so much, Paul, for having me.
Well, it's great to see you. Happy summer. Hope you're doing well. We're watching the Olympics here and enjoying that, but I'm looking forward to talking to you about this wonderful upcoming walk that you have planned with Smithsonian Associates. These are always really fun to go on. And it's always a fun interview, too, because I like the opportunity to describe some of the surroundings. I think that offers a really nice theater of the mind. But anyway, welcome. Well, let's just start kind of right at the start. Maybe tell us briefly about your upcoming Smithsonian Associates walk, what we're going to experience, and, kind of what you intend for us to leave with.
Great. Well, yeah, I was thinking about as we're now in the sort of the 90th anniversary of the New Deal from the 1930s. And it seemed like a good time to sort of assess, like, well, what is happening now? We've gone through several crises in recent years, including the pandemic. And in some ways, people at that time were comparing that with the Great Depression. And so kind of looking back, and as you know, I've written and thought about that period before.
Yeah.
So I got engaged in that again, working on a podcast and also thinking about, well, in the landscape, what can we see? And actually, it turns out that from that time, there is a lot in towns across America. We can see evidence of things that were built during the New Deal, whether it's post offices or schools or roads. And one organization that got me thinking was this private nonprofit called the Living New Deal Project. And they have created maps of several different cities, including one of Washington, D.C.'s New Deal, And it's kind of just a thumbnail picture of these buildings and sculptures and murals that we can still see in the landscape today. So I thought it'd be fun to go through Washington, go through a slice of maybe a couple of hours of walk, and with a group of people who are interested in seeing that evidence still around.
Thank you for that. Yeah, as I say, I think this is going to be wonderful. I really enjoy the architecture of Washington, D.C., especially these murals. We're going to share some of these murals both in our show notes, but in the video version of today's interview. They're beautiful. They have a very specific look to them. And I wonder if you could talk for just a second about kind of the goals of the New Deal and how those goals translated into kind of some of these public works arts projects in particular.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, as anyone who's sort of taken a history class, probably you would hear the first thing you would hear about the New Deal was it was an effort by President Franklin Roosevelt coming in. He pledged a New Deal for the American people to get out of the Great Depression. It had been dragging on for 4 years. He was elected in 1932, and in the years after he was inaugurated, he started to create this effort to get the economy back on its feet. And at the time, economists were saying, well, one way to do that is to prime the pump through public spending. And so the New Deal was kind of a two-step effort to spend on public works that were needed, that had been deferred for a long time. Infrastructure, hear a lot about infrastructure. That was a really time when there had been needs for infrastructure for a while, but there had always been pushed off. But this was a way to both employ people and get them working, get people who were out of work, millions of people to work, and at the same time, build up the public store of infrastructure, of roads, of pools, of things that we could see and use and that were needed to get the economy going again. So that was a primary goal. A secondary goal, especially for many of the arts projects, was to keep the skills and the aspirations of people in play. There was a sense that, of course, at that time, even the idea of public support for people who were out of work, there was no Social Security at the start of the New Deal. There was no general, even accepted, consensus that was a role for government. So it was still a provocative idea to create these jobs, to even build the public works that were needed. But it was especially controversial to the artists and writers and musicians. It really took actually protests by writers, for example, demonstrating as these infrastructure works got started, saying, we need jobs too. We have skills. And the New Deal became enlarged to hire thousands of writers and musicians and artists with the idea of maintaining their skills, maintaining morale for when the economy got turned around and was able to employ them. So there was the idea that you could see the benefits of this society and you could see the values reflected there. And so that it could also be part of priming the pump so that people still have skills and have the morale to work and not just ride the freight trains looking for handouts like millions of hobos that were riding the rails in the Great Depression. So it was that twofold process of really getting the economy started with infrastructure support, but also at the household level, getting families to feel back part of the economy again, have at least a small paycheck from a New Deal arts agency. And the artists then feel that their skills are valued. They could make a mural representing their local history. Or in the case of writers, they could be writing about their local town or a WPA guidebook to the state. That would boost their self-esteem and their sense of agency.
Well, I mentioned that you're a returning guest and you've been on previously and have been so popular with our audience. Of course, you authored the wonderful book, Soul of a People, the WPA Writers Project Uncovers Depression America, which really emphasized this writing. Absolutely. There it is. And we will show it again on screen and provide that for people in terms of the links. Maybe talk to us a little bit about some of the examples that came from the New Deal's investment in the arts and how that influenced some of the contemporary public arts initiatives that we see even today.
That's a really great question because at the time, there was so much about the controversy about hiring writers and artists that there was a sense that, yes, they could contribute, but it was really just the paychecks that were what paid off. But really what you saw was an investment in especially young writers who were maybe just got out of college and into this terrible economy. they gain the skills of being assigned to, say, interview their fellow citizens and write up and basically engage with the world, write up their response to it, and create meaning from that. And that did have a long-term influence on writing, on literature. I mean, what we see just in terms of that the Writers' Project, people who came out of that were some of the first winners of the National Book Award, and really like a bestseller, Richard Wright's Native Son. He worked on the Writers' Project in Chicago and New York, and this Book of the Month Club, a sensation about race, about society in 1940, and was really kind of a very forward, at that time, a look at what these forces were in play and how we can look at them from different angles and not just accept the way we've always heard about them. There was very much of a kind of a social everyman quality to both the arts, as you mentioned, the murals. There's a lot of both rural and almost mythic scale, human-centered scenes that workers and industry workers, farm workers, families putting food on the table.
They have this wonderful look of strength and power. They're sometimes stocky and sometimes a bit squat, but I always look at that and see the strength. Is that a message that was portrayed and one purposefully done?
That is a message. I mean, Art Deco, that style had started in the 1920s, and it was popular for showing things like social progress and this kind of eventual wave of society marching forward. With the Depression and in the 1930s, it got a little subdued, but it was still very much the idea that, working together, people can, society can march forward, can walk forward. So a lot of these, certainly here in Washington, you see statues like at the Memorial Bridge of really powerful and leading a horse forward, whether it's the idea of either plowing or just a journey. There's a real sense of strength, but not out of top-down strength, but really sort of a bottom-up strength that we have.
Hi, it's Paul. Do you love entertaining, informative, eclectic, insightful programs about culture, health, science, life, and everything Smithsonian? As part of our Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast, we're introducing you to the new Smithsonian Associates streaming series. Smithsonian, a nonprofit organization, is excited to present this new aspect of their 55 years as the world's largest museum-based educational program. Join us from the comfort of your home as we periodically interview Smithsonian Associate guest speakers. Our audience here on radio and podcast can explore our website for more information, links, and details at notold-better.com. Thanks, everybody. Well, let's take a little walk then. Let's do that, David. So your walking tour begins at Judiciary Square, and you're going to talk a little bit about some of the public sculptures that are there and the courthouse, the bas reliefs. And this is some of the work of John Gregory. So maybe whet our appetites a little bit with regard to this work and tell us what we might see there and how the sculpture kind of ties into all of this too. Because again, it's very, very purposeful, in my mind, at least.
Yeah. I mean, I thought a long time about where to start this tour, and both the buildings and the sculptures, as you mentioned, at Judiciary Square, seem like a combination that really speaks to both this creation of these infrastructure needs. So there had been, like, for over a century, the city of Washington had been trying to get a municipal center created, and the budgeting for it was constantly delayed. But there at Judiciary Square, they finally got funding to create, basically a stripped down classical version. And they thought, that the sculptures that they could commission at that time would really sort of soften and make more of an impact. So there is this sense of several figures that are, the bas-reliefs that are in stone. As you mentioned, the John Gregory one, there's one called Light, Water, and Thoroughfare. Mm-hmm. And it sort of represents in classical figures these public goods of light, of utility, water utilities, and of transportation. Public goods that we could actually see then characterized in these public settings. It hadn't been done in quite that figurative way before the 1930s, before those New Deal buildings. So I thought that was a good place to do it. Again, stepping back briefly, FDR, Roosevelt said one of his statements that I like was, in 100 years, my administration will be remembered for its art, not its It's jobs relief. And I mean, that was I think it was intended as kind of a provocative statement, as a statement to turn the spotlight away from this controversial paying people who were out of work to go back to work. But I think it was aspirational that and we're still, 90 years on. It's still maybe not maybe too soon to say, but we still can look at the things like the sculptures, the bas-reliefs at Judiciary Square, and some of the ones even more monumental we'll talk about in a bit at Federal Trade Commission and all that really show this sense of public life and the values that we have about society and progress that he and his administration put kind of a stamp on the landscape.
I'm a former federal employee and worked at the Treasury Department, and so many of the government office buildings, I think, are enjoyed by those of us who worked within them. The one that you're going to talk a little bit about there at Judiciary Square, bas-relief, with regard to the Henry F. Daly building, is representational of a government building that looks very strong and very powerful in the same way that some of these sculptures and artworks do. And tell us a little bit about that building and the classical modern style that was used and what the construction, because there's a lot of great stories there with regard to the Daly building. Yeah,
and actually, I'd be interested to hear any that you would care to add on to. There are so many, and it's interesting because sometimes those who have worked inside it and have seen a lot of it, whether it's murals or other, even just some of the architectural details that you can't always get to now, especially in the age of heightened security. I will only be able to cover some of them. So, but I would imagine some of the people walking on the tour with me, and maybe yourself too, would be able to fill in just from that daily exposure to whether it's the elevators or the filigree around on the stairwells, just things that we don't that become part of our everyday impressions. That the tour and this kind of walk will be able to slow us down and see this is something that was put there intentionally, whether the architect. And in the case of the Daly building, and in the case of the architect of the National Archives, John Russell Pope, he designed that building well before the Depression or before the New Deal in the 1920s, but it didn't get funded until going into the 1930s. But he did have a hand in choosing who the sculptures and the designs were there. So in some ways, those show that effect in this figurative scale and things that we can relate to even more strongly than sometimes the big square stone buildings and the columns. But the combination really is powerful. And I think that the people going in there, and whether it's into the municipal building for its purposes now or into the justice halls with the courthouse, you get a sense of this public life that was intended. These effects, and then the bas-reliefs give sort of a human element that make us appreciate them in a different way. But that monumental scale, the height of the ceilings and these stone lobbies give us a sense of, wow, a public life that really is remarkable. One thing that struck me, I don't know if you saw the movie Fences a few years ago with Denzel Washington, and mostly it happens, it takes place in Pittsburgh. It's in a really not a prosperous section of Black Pittsburgh, but it was one of the shots it shows is Denzel Washington working downtown for a bit and going past a big mural in the place where he works. And you get a sense of these aspirations of society. And then the contrast with people's lives in their homes and what they're kind of pulling together in hard times. But that there is these big social spaces give us a chance to think about what we do value, what we hope for ourselves and for future generations. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. It is a little bit of a shame that we're not able to get entry to some of these spaces now, kind of post 9/11, post COVID even. I remember within the Treasury building, the Indian Treaty Room was so beautiful because it just represented this gorgeous space of real importance. And so Treasury had a number of receptions there that we as employees would get to go to. You mentioned the Federal Trade Commission building, and that is another one that is just stunning and strong, but very much in the Art Deco kind of mode. Maybe tell us a little bit about the Art Deco and how that was embraced, specifically when it comes to the art and the architecture of the Federal Trade Commission building. Yeah, so that is a fascinating. The Federal Trade Commission building, too, was an agency that had started in a couple of decades earlier, in 1914. It was a relatively new agency that was with the idea of protecting consumers and fair competition. So it was sort of a populist agency, but it didn't really get its full life until the 1930s with the new FTC building. And there's great stories there. I look forward to talking about those on the tour. One of them is simply about the commissioning of some of the monumental sculptures. And one is of a bare-chested, muscular guy controlling a really powerful horse. The idea is controlling trade. The idea of this agency, this not represented, this bureaucratic agency represented by a kind of a hunky guy, mastering and keeping this uncontrolled horse of trade from getting out of control, and really giving a chance for the public to gain this good. One of the stories that I love about that sculpture actually is the artist who got that commission was 29 years old, working on a WPA arts relief job in New Rochelle, New York. And then suddenly he has this commission that takes him to Washington to be able to create on a massive scale something that he couldn't have dreamt of before. And I think that's like one of the dream stories of these arts projects, is that you would get a chance to work on a scale that maybe you were an out of work painter before. You get a basic job, and then if you've submit a proposal that's just at the right time, you get this commission to do what the Washington Post even wrote up 2 weeks before. He was just someone nobody knew in New Rochelle, New York, on a WPA relief job, and now he's this on a $45,000 commission in Washington, and is a sort of a turnabout of his fortunes.
Yeah, it really resulted in so much change in the DC area. The National Mall and the Washington Monument are all part of this New Deal initiative at the time. Talk a little bit about those projects and how they contributed to the revitalization of big public spaces that all of us get to go to today.
Yeah. So that was a surprise to me also, even looking and seeing that, the Washington Monument had been planned for a restoration, but it really took some of the funds from the WPA and the Public Works Administration, the PWA, to really make that happen. You're right. This is one of the biggest landmarks of U.S. and it predated the New Deal, but it was one that was sustained by that effort at that time. And, that we continue to see and continue to enjoy. And we often pass we think, okay, they built the Washington Monument. It went up slowly in the 1800s and finally it was finished. And then we enjoy it. But there's all these steps of renovating and continuing to maintain the process. And the National Park Service is a key part of this landscape that we enjoy. They manage the National Mall. And it's a great chance to reflect on that.
Yeah. And they're still very much a part of the city. And softball is played on the mall during the summer months. We have, of course, the massive 4th of July celebration out on the mall, and there are metro stops at Smithsonian, which exit right at the mall. So it's a focal point, but it's also it's a landmark for all of the Washington, D.C. denizens who know that that's the place that they can spoke out to and find other great things to do from. So
it's a good point. Yeah, I was just, in fact, when the solstice happened in June, some of the museums were open late. So I thought, I'll go down the mall. So I went from the Library of Congress, walked down the mall, and saw several softball games, stopped and talked with one of the congressional aides, filled me in on, Hawaii was losing to West Virginia, but they hope to get back. And all these small scale scenes happening on this big canvas. There was a nonprofit playing kickball just on the other side of the World War II memorial, and then many families going up to the Lincoln Memorial. So it was this combination of local and even family scale dramas and scenes happening on this big canvas.
Well, of course, you've talked about your work, and I can't let you go really without mentioning again the wonderful book that you've written, Soul of a People. The WPA Writers Project uncovers Depression in America. Maybe touch on that just a little bit, because the names of the writers that you uncovered that were part of that WPA Writers Project is a very impressive list of people. But maybe tell us a little bit about that book and where things stand today.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yes, this was actually this year. I've had a chance to go back with the team at Spark Media that I work with on a documentary based from Soul of a People, and we've revisited it in a podcast called The People's Recorder, that really where we can hear some of those voices. One of the famous writers from the Writers Project and from that time, Zora Neale Hurston, now recognized as one of the great storytellers of 20th century. She was hired by the Writers Project in Florida to document Florida life, and particularly Black Florida life. She interviewed people for the WPA Guide to Florida, and then she also proposed a recording tour, borrowing sound equipment from the Library of Congress, and using her background in and ethnology to really to interview and to record the songs that people sang just in their home life. So she's one of the great ones. Ralph Ellison, who wrote Invisible Man, he worked on the Writers Project in New York when he was out of work, but he had an ear for people's stories, and he was inspired by the interviews that he made in that time for the Writers Project. And really, that gave a shape for his great novel, Invisible Man, later. I mentioned Richard Wright. He's one. Yeah. Nelson Algren was another great writer of that period. Several of his novels came out of his experience writing then. John Cheever was kind of a reluctant member of the Writers Project. His short stories and his novel Falconer later in the 70s too, just really an iconic American voice. And some voices I hadn't heard before going into this Writers Project, revisiting for audio. Tilly Olsen on the West Coast, and people in Chicago. Of course, Studs Terkel, we got to interview for the documentary. So I hope people will check out the People's Recorder too, to see really, or to hear more of the voices of those great writers and what they did both during that time, but also what it means for us now.
Well, our guest, of course, has been David Taylor, Smithsonian associate, historian, author of just the wonderful book, Soul of a People. We'll have links so that our audience can find out more about David Taylor and his work, particularly his book, Soul of a People, and the documentary that David just mentioned. David, for anybody not able to join you on the tour, maybe tell us what your favorite mural is. We'll put that up on screen so that people can see it, but maybe describe it and tell us what you like most about it.
That's a great question. There are so many great murals and really across, just traveling anywhere. That's what really strikes me is, and that what the Living New Deal finds is that you can find these murals and things in post offices and train stations everywhere. But one that really struck me is at the end of the tour, we'll find in the Interior Department building, one by Ben Shahn, a later famous artist. He created this really wide scope of building really a monumental structure. And you can see even the crane pulling pieces of the work into place. And you just get this sense of uplift of people working together on this massive scale and creating something bigger than any of them could imagine on their own. And that mural in the Interior Department really captures it for me.
Smithsonian associate David Taylor's been our guest. David, thanks again for joining us today, for being so generous. What a great upcoming walk this is going to be. I just encourage our audience to check this out. You're in DC. This is one of those must-do activities with David Taylor. But David, thank you. Hope you have a great rest of your summer. And, just selfishly, please come back. It's so nice to talk to you.
Thanks so much, Paul. It's been a pleasure. And have a great summer, the rest of your summer too.
Thank you, David. My thanks to David Taylor and his upcoming Smithsonian Associates Walking Tour titled New Deal Projects Walking Tour on the New Deal, a transformative period in American history that not only aimed to revive the economy, but also left an indelible mark on the arts and culture. My thanks to you, our wonderful audience here on the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associate interview series on radio and podcast. My thanks to executive producer Sam Hanniger for all his work on audio, making things run smoothly, absolutely here on the show as well as elsewhere. Please be well, be safe. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. Thanks, everybody. We will see you next week.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. To find out more about all of today's stories or to view our extensive back catalog of previous shows, simply visit notold-better.com. Join us again next time as we deep dive into some of the most fascinating real-life stories from across the world, all focused on this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show.
Hi, one final thing. Please check out our website for this episode and all episodes at notold-better.com or subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to check out your local radio stations to find out more about the Not Old Better Show on podcast and radio. You can find us all over social media. Our Twitter feed is Not Old Better, and we're on Instagram at Not Old Better too. The Not Old Better Show is a production of NOBS Studios. I'm Paul Vogelsang, and I hope you'll join me again next time to talk about better. The Not Old Better Show. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.